I've got strict instructions to move very, very quickly in the hope that we can contract time and make sure we can start the panel sessions on time very soon. But first, welcome to the first plenary of the conference. The title of this plenary is Discourse, Materiality, Reality, Fantasy. In part, this panel is about how we can or should talk about matter, as well as the things that matter to us, at least in the wake of the discursive turn. In other words, in summary, the conference starts off with a big bang. The big bang, straight into deep ontological waters, but not, we hope, without empirical relevance. Today's inaugural plenary session features speakers who will talk on themes that cut across the conference, that is to say, populism, materiality, visuality, political economy. We have, first, Aysem Mert, who is from the Department of Political Science, Stockholm University. Aysem is the author of Environmental Governance Through Partnerships, a Discourse Theoretical Study, and Aysem will be speaking to the title From Utopian Socialism to Ecotopia at the End of History. As you will see, most of these speakers, I'm sure everyone will be aware, are very central to the thinking and the development of discourse theory in general, critical reflection on discourse theory and developments in general. We have, in addition to Aysem, we've got Nico Carpentier, who is, as the previous speaker said, quite nomadic. I find it very hard to keep track of where he is, but at the moment at the Department of Media Studies at Charles University Prague. Nico is the author, among others, of The Discursive Material Not, Cyprus in Conflict and Community Media Participation, and most recently, Respublika, ! Experiments in the Performance of Participation and Democracy. And Nico will be speaking to the title, The Discursive Material Not and Participatory Theory. We have, in addition, Yannis Stavrakakis, who is at the School of Political Science, Aristotle University, Thessaloniki. Yannis is the author, among others, of Lacan and the Political and the Lacanian Left, and is known to many of us as the lead of the highly successful research project Populismus, of course. And finally, we've got Johannes Angelmüller. Johannes is at the Center for Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick, and is the author, among others, of Why There Is No Post-Structuralism in France, and Post-Structuralist Discourse Analysis. Also known to many of us as the coordinator of DiscourseNet, which is a popular platform that connects discourse researchers across many disciplines and many nations. And Johannes will be speaking to the title Truth and Untruth in Discourse for a Strong Program in Discourse Research. Now, the format is today, we will have about 15 minutes, I think we're going to have about for the speakers to say something, one after the other, consecutive, and then we will open it up for a general debate and discussion. And the proposal is that we have each speaker staying where they are in the audience in order to be able to see the projector, and individually to come up and then return to the seat until the end, when we will all come up and sit here at the front. Is that okay? Aysem.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Aysem Mert and I'm at Stockholm University. And I'm very happy to be here and to discuss some very experimental work, which I did not imagine would end up in the plenary opening of this conference. So when I have seen the call for papers, what I thought was, oh, I have this idea, and let's just wing it. Let's send it in and see how it resonates with the greater discourse theory crowd. So please take what I'm about to present to you as something that I'm thinking about, and that's why there's this big disclaimer at the beginning of my paper that says, please don't share this, please don't quote this, and let's talk about this in the context of my earlier work. Having said that, I find this a fantastic opportunity to start thinking about some novel developments in discourse theory. Because in my previous work, in particular, I was so much influenced by all the people in this room, and particularly about the relationship between psychoanalysis, language, and the political and social logics. However, there has been an increasing transformation and interest in the study of fantasy and how we connect that to empirical work. And this is my way of starting to understand how to read fantasy into empirical work. So the paper is uploaded, and I would really love to hear what some of you have to say about this. And I'm going to describe it to you very quickly because I do not have slides. And the reason for that is they have forgotten to bring my luggage here. So this is the nightmare scenario. The idea of the paper is very much based on how post-structuralism starts thinking about the phantasmal based on a fantasy of perfect fulfillment, an impossibility, but at the same time something that gives drive to our political projects in so many ways. And we can think about this in terms of the phantasmatic logic, but also we can think about this in how the speed of political processes are affected by certain phantasmal dynamics and operations. So when we look at Mouffe, she looks into desires. When we look at Jason and David's work, we look at the logics. And when we look at Lacan and later people, they make us notice how the idea of fantasy makes us postpone fulfillment, both in terms of anger, but in terms of enjoyment. And I think Yannis Stavrakakis notes very beautifully when he says this is simultaneously the production of a social group that caused the lack. So how do we deal with this paradox, and how do we create a distance from the negative populism, so to speak, of the alt-right and so on? And then David Howard is obviously making this claim to how this affects the epistemologies, and how can we think about fantasy without falling into the trap of imagining it does not connect to lived reality and the materiality of things. And in order to perhaps bridge this gap, in my mind, one way of looking at it is to look at what we imagine as an ideal society, a utopia, and how we can move from where we are to that utopia. And the closest moment for this has been at the end of the 1800s, at the beginning of the 1900s, when people were actively imagining utopias that they were trying to later create, for instance, or write about them in beautiful ways. So utopia at the same time is a word for a place that doesn't exist. And I don't think we put enough emphasis on that. It cannot exist either. And this impossibility of perfect fulfillment of the utopia is critical for the whole genre. But if you look at what has been imagined at the end of the 1800s by the first utopian authors, was that this perfect harmony among citizens, a general lack of discontent and dislocation, and in the three utopias I study in the paper, they have quite a set of interesting statements to make about politics as well. So these three utopias are Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, wherein, for instance, the protagonist wakes up 113 years later in 2000. And he wakes up into a socialist utopia where, there's equal respect for jobs, there's a lack of leisure class, an infinitely more efficient production system, and so on. And the conversation between the host and the person that finds himself in the utopia comes out as, oh, we don't have any legislation because laws were there to protect private property. Now that we don't have private property, who needs laws? For instance, the other utopia I like studying very much, William Morris's News from Nowhere. His utopian society is much less focused on efficiency, much more focused on beauty and handicraft and reverting to an economy based on agricultural production and so forth. And when the protagonist asks his host about their political system, the host responds, I am the only person, because I'm so old, I know the word, but nobody else would know the word politics, because who needs politics? We have none. And then he says there's no political platform other than neighborhood meetings in our society, and we turned the Parliament House in London into the dung market so that it would prove useful. And this repeats itself in the utopian genre, and if you look at H.G. Wells, he really likes crushing it into the reader's mind by saying that members of the government realize that they have done nothing relevant. One of them says, we have done nothing worth doing. The other responds, I have been a fool. We have to forgive even ourselves. It gets really dramatic later on. We had been monstrous, and goes on and on. And in the end, all three authors refer to certain democratic principles in the management of communitarian matters, but these are often matters of production, and somehow democratic management results in everybody agreeing on the most obvious, reasonable choice. So there is no antagonism, there is no disagreement. If something is a personal decision, everybody does as they like. If something is not a personal decision, there's already a factual, rational way of finding the best option. And everybody obviously agrees to this. And what I find quite interesting with this whole process is politics naturally vanishes in these novels. They do not vanish as a result of a political struggle. And if you look at some of the common points, you would notice that what constitutes the change between the societies in which these novels were written and the society they idealized was that there's just an equitable distribution of property on the one hand, common ownership, and so on, a different attitude towards different types of labor, which I'm sure many of us would largely agree on. But then there's also this simplification of difference and a total lack of antagonism. The second common point is that what constitutes the revolution is usually not very much reflected upon. In one of the novels, the protagonist wakes up, and because there's a comet passing by, everybody turns socialist. There was a soporific cloud. In the other one, the author just was dreaming, and in the third one, it is something else similar to that, some magical situation. And there is no actual organization of society to turn from the situation it is in to the situation we would idealize. And this, I think, is a very nice moment for reflection for discourse theory, because I think we have the tools a little bit to open the conversation to what constitutes the barrier for change. But if we look at what constitutes the barrier for change in discourse theory to talk about these matters, I would go back to Marx and Engels. Because there's this moment when Engels makes a point about utopian socialism, when he says to have utopian socialism is very problematic because there are many different interpretations of socialism in the utopian thought, and this can both divide the working class, but also it can result in an eclectic average socialism, and this is very undesirable. What we need, he says, and I quote, to make a science of socialism, it had to be first placed on a real basis. And this real basis has for a very long time been historical materialism, which we do not seem to have benefited from for a very long time. So now we are standing in a threshold where for the first time, we can connect new materialism and studies of empirical research with what we can use as a way to change how we think about the society, but also how we think about science. To connect the dots, now that I'm running out of time, I would like to turn to another type of utopia. This is a much later genre, and I don't know for sure that it is even fair to compare the utopian, the ecological utopias of the 1970s with the socialist utopias of the late 1800s, early 1900s. But the only reason why I'm doing this is that I was thinking mostly about how can we get out of this space where the differences are ignored and we're asked to almost unthink antagonism and move to a place where we can talk actively about antagonism. We can talk actively about conflict without turning into any anti-democratic space for its resolution. And the only utopia that I could find that responds to this was Ecotopia. Ecotopia by Ernest Kellenbach was basically starting with this sentence that gave me joy, so I will share it with you. They turned to politics because it was finally the only route to self-preservation. And in the 20th century, there are more and more multiplications of these thoughts, but the focus is often moving from utopias of abundance to utopias of sufficiency. And because I'm working with environmental politics, this is something very interesting to me, but not for this conference. For this conference, what matters is that ecotopians imagined in this book are very, very bottom-up democratic in the way that they organize society. And there are theorists, there are opposition groups, there are so many differences in the society that at some point the host has to explain to the visitor of this utopia that, okay, but this whole idea is very much dependent on having an agreement. We have a root agreement, and everything else can be eclectic and imperfect and disagreed upon and so forth. So if we allow ourselves to step back from the discussion that has been going on between the Habermasians and the Rawlsians and Chantal Mouffe and so on, there is a lot to be said and to be learned from how can we create democratic spaces that are at the same time allowing for antagonisms to exist, but also creating the tools and using the novel genres and technologies to create the voices to exist, not necessarily to reach a consensus, not necessarily to convince each other that this is the way to think about things, but to officially create more than one way to reach a democratic agreement where we can be eclectic and different and antagonistic and so on. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to listen to the next presentations with interest. Thank you very much.